This is the latest episode of the Time Enough podcast with me, Ed Oldham. And joining me this week is Alan Cope. Now, Alan and I first met a couple of weeks ago because we were made aware of the fact that you, Alan, are going to do an abseil down Liverpool Anglican Cathedral quite soon. So first off, welcome to the podcast and thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And well, as I said, you know, our introduction was through this interview, and let's start off talking just a little bit about the reasons why you want to do this abseil down the Anglican Cathedral.
Yeah, well, the reason is quite simple. I first abseiled when I was 13 years of age. The school was evacuated into Bude in Cornwall, and as a youngster, one of the teachers took us out and hammered a big long nail into the ground, put some rope round it, threw it over the cliff, showed us how to put the rope round our body, and down we went down the cliffs. No hard hat, no safety line, no nothing. Rope through your leg, round your body, down your back, and down, just gym shoes, and we thoroughly enjoyed it.
And at 90 years old, it's still something that you want to do.
Well, it's. I was told. Well, 3 years ago, I went down the TT Tower for MS, the charity, and I was told that the Roy Castle Foundation was doing this abseil down Liverpool Cathedral, and I said yes, I'll go for that. And of course, these days it is safe because you have a harness with a safety line, so they do have hold of you. It's only the question, it's 100-odd metres, and the thing is, look at your feet, which are horizontal to the ground, but don't look down.
You make it all sound very simple, very logical, and I think if you approach it in that logical way, then that removes a lot of the fear of something like that, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. And the Roy Castle, which some people may not know, whilst he died of lung cancer, he never ever smoked. It was doing gigs in pubs, working men's clubs, nightclubs, and that he inhaled the smoke. And the Royal Castle Foundation gives money mainly to find cures for apparently there are a variety people of lung cancers which people can get, and they have succeeded in eliminating some of the problems. And hopefully, in due course, they'll be able to eliminate all the problems.
And your experience of Roy Castle goes back a long, long time. You mentioned that in the interview as well, seeing him, the Royal Variety in 1958, was it?
58, yes, that's correct.
He made quite an impression upon you.
He looked like a youngster, and he tap danced, he played 2 or 3 instruments, he sang, and he actually brought the house down. He was the best turn.
What were you doing at the time then? So 1958, you would have been late 20s, almost 30
Correct.
Years old? Yeah.
Yes. I had qualified as a chartered accountant.
And you were based in London then?
I was based in London at that time, yes.
What was it like in that period?
In that period, well, it was shortly after the war. Now you've got me thinking. I went into the RAF, did my national service before. Actually, I was one of the first group of people who were allowed to qualify before they did their national service. So we went in, there were 12 of us that went in. I first volunteered for the Navy, but they were only taking permanent 3-year minimum commissions. So then I opted for the Air Force. So I thought I'd learn to be a pilot at the government's expense. Unfortunately, I suffer from hay fever, of which I'm suffering from actually at the moment.
It is really bad at the moment. I'm suffering too, yeah.
Yes, I'm a bit chesty. And so I was not allowed to do that, A4, G4 graded. And that's an interesting story, actually, at that time, because at the end of our square bashing in Padgate, just outside Warrington, the other 11 accountants went off to Norfolk for an accounts course, and I was left at Padgate. And I said, well, why aren't I there? And the answer was, well, you're not fit enough to be an officer, So I said, why? So he said, well, because you'll be grounded A4, G4, medical grading because of your hay fever. And so I said, well, in my book, if I'm not fit enough to be an officer, I'm not fit enough to be an airman. I'm quite happy to do the 2 years, but in these circumstances, I'll have my discharge, please.
So you were discharged? You didn't do national service?
No, I was not discharged.
Oh, you're not? No.
No, the CO said he would look into it, and the next day I was transferred to Stafford. And give Stafford their due, I went through the same performance there, but they did put me in the accounts section, which dealt with the ins and outs of equipment, and it's a very large maintenance unit for the RAF. And I could see things that were coming in, which really they were going straight out onto the auction site because they were now obsolete. And I did a report into Air Ministry that I thought, well, I first gave it to the WWII sergeant, who was in charge of our little section, and she was more interested in doing the Daily Mirror crossword than she wasn't doing anything else. And I suggested that why aren't these orders cancelled in advance? And she said, well, if you like, you can do a paper, so which I did. And the long and short of it was, it went up to Air Ministry, I got called to Air Ministry, and one reason or another, it was just put at the bottom of the pile. But nevertheless, they did send me to join the others on the accounts course. And I thought, well, they'll give me that chance, and then they will chop me. And then they say, well, it's not my fault, you failed the exam. So while we worked for it, it wasn't really necessary, because whilst there were about 40 people on the course, most of them were ex-pilots who got too old for flying. A lot of them couldn't change from piston planes to jet planes, but they were all on permanent commissions. Well, they joined the Air Force to fly. They didn't join the Air Force to become secretarial or accountant officers.
Yes.
So they didn't care. So out of the first, I think, 12 places, 10 of us were accountants.
And given your age at the time then, so you just missed having to serve in the Second World War by about a year or two.
Correct.
I suppose. So
yeah.
What was the war experience like for you? Because I suppose you were a relatively old age in that you would have been a pre-teen to teenage years in that time, so you would have had some experience of it, and possibly with not knowing how long the war was going to last, potentially with that prospect of going to fight looming over you as well.
Well, going back after Dunkirk, which was the end of May 1940, it looked very much as if England was going to lose the war. In fact, quite honestly, I could vividly recall those days. My prep school, which was Dulwich College Prep School, was evacuated to Cranbrook in Kent, just, I think, 10 to 15 miles from the coast. And so we saw people coming back, the injured, what have you. And the Germans could have sent a lifeboat of troops because we had nothing. They were young men, old men were exercising with broom handles and things. They had no rifles. However, they wanted to get the children out, and a lot of them were shipped out to Australia, Canada, wherever. And my father was able to ask a friend in Los Angeles whether he would sponsor his wife and 2 children, which they very kindly did. And so we went shipped out in July 1940 to the States. And that I had a very interesting experience out there, interesting. I was the only boy in the whole school that wore short trousers because the Americans from day one are in long trousers, which was a bit embarrassing, but they accepted that. And the one day going to school, I usually cycled, but it was raining, so I went to the bus stop. And another lad in the same form who I hardly knew said, "Would you like to share my umbrella?" And we have been friends ever since.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Is he still in Los Angeles then.
He is still in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, he couldn't come over. They were going to come to my 90th birthday party, but they couldn't come because he's undergoing cancer treatment, which regards every week going in to be given some drugs or chemotherapy.
Of course.
So, yeah, interesting life.
I bet. So there was, I suppose, from that stage, were you there for the remainder of the war then in Los Angeles?
No, we were only there for 2 years. For personal reasons, we came back. But one day,
I guess
mother...
the tide was turning by that stage anyway, wasn't it?
No, 1942. No, it was
still not so good. No,
it was the height of the Blitz, actually.
So you came back to that, yeah.
Be that as it may, one day when I came back from school, I asked my mother for some pocket money, and she said, I'd like to give you, but I haven't got enough to pay the electricity bill, because obviously she was just given an allowance by this family, which they undertook a tremendous responsibility, which I realise now, obviously as a child you don't, to take a woman with 2 kids more or less for life, because they thought that England could have lost the war. However, be that as it may, and the next day at school, there was a man going round signing up children to sell newspapers and magazines. So I signed up to sell newspapers. And I came home in the evening. I said, it's okay, Mom. You don't need to give me pocket money. I'm going to sell newspapers. And to this day, I can remember her standing, looking at me and saying, no father of yours would have his son sell newspapers. And I said, well, Dad's not here and I need money. And I sold newspapers. And right next door to the apartment block was a garage. So I was there shouting one day, Roosevelt says this or the other. And a car drives up, the man pulls down his window, he leans out and he says, it's Roosevelt. And I, being, 12 years of age, said, 00 in England is oo, it's Roosevelt. And he said, you say Roosevelt, son, and I'll give you a quarter. I said, Roosevelt says this. He gave me the quarter, drove off. I said, Roosevelt.
And so you came...
We came back in 1942.
In a period then it wasn't very good at all still.
And then I went to Clifton College, which was in Bristol, but they had evacuated down to Bude in Cornwall. And that is where we went out with the master and went down the cliffs. So
what was it like come the end of the war then? What was the atmosphere like? What was the sense like, both for you personally and those around you, your school friends and the like, and the people that you knew? What was that like?
Oh, it was euphoric, because it was something which wasn't going to be. Yes, it was a good time. Everybody was pulled together, very much more so than today.
And just, I guess, a real sense of relief.
Yes,
that things could,
definitely.
I guess, slowly get back to normal. Yeah. And so, yes, you ended up doing the national service in the wake of the war, obviously, and then taking yourself off to London. How did you end up on the Isle of Man then? Was that some years later?
I came over here in winter of 1959 for a short break, get away from London. And I got involved in a business, thinking they could send the returns across to the UK and I could come periodically. I very soon learnt that if somebody wasn't here to sort the mess out, there would be no business. So I stayed to do that, liked the way of life, and thought, well, you won't earn so much money as I would in London, but rather than smelling diesel fumes and cars and 25 minutes at least each way to go to work and back, you could hear the birds in the morning and could smell the roses. And that is why I think the Isle of Man is probably the finest place in the world in which to live.
And this coming from someone who has travelled a lot as well. You've been to many, many places for various reasons, and you have a real love of the sea and sailing, don't you?
Yeah, I have a real love of the sea and sailing, but what really I think started my travel experience was that in 1937 my parents went to Switzerland for Christmas time, and that is where I learnt to ski, and in 1938 similarly. And really, skiing is my first sport. Also, coming to sailing, I was born in Beckenham in Kent, and we were bombed out in the war. And my parents took over a place 3 miles upstream from Henley on the river, and right next door was a boathouse. So once again, a kid of 12 goes in the boathouse. And that is where I learnt sailing, punting, and generally small boat handling.
And sailing has taken you from that river, taken you from Henley to many, many places. I believe you've sailed across the Atlantic.
Yep.
So you and your wife at the time?
Yes. We did that in about 1978. I was driving up the M1 one night from London to Northampton, and I had pulled up with warning hazard lights on because there had been an accident ahead, and a fella slides into me at 80 miles an hour, and I got what the doctor called a broken back. Fortunately, my lower spine was compressed, and I was on my back for about 3 months with traction. And lying there, I have 3 children. At that time, the youngest was 18, 20, 22. And I thought, why go on a quarter of an inch one way or the other? I could have been paralysed or dead. So I liquidated most things and got myself a 40-foot boat. Put so much in for the boat, so much for investment, because I had always had a dream of one day sailing across the Pacific to the pristine sands, the palm trees swaying, the girls in grass skirts. And the idea was to see the world. And so we set off. When I got down to northern Spain, my business partner died, and I got landed with winding up his estate. And so I commuted. I was 2 years in the Med, commuted back to wind the estate up. And then we went down through Madeira, the Canaries, 23 days across to Barbados, turned left, went down to Tobago, Grenada, and all the way up the chain.
That sounds incredible. What's it like being out there in the open sea for an extended period like that? Just you and your wife, just you on that vessel, and no one else around.
Wonderful. The crossing actually from the Canaries to Barbados was absolutely magnificent. I put 2 foresails out, wing and wing, Genoa, and even went to bed at night. You had a constant force 3, force 4 wind, just taking you dead behind in the trade winds, warm nights. The stars looked like diamonds. You could take them out, look at them, and put them back in the firmament. The spray across the bow with the dolphins coming. It's a magical experience.
It sounds like it. I imagine it must give you that real sense of sort of scale of everything as well, and your kind of place with it, your very small place within it all, and the permanence of things around you as well.
Oh yeah, I thought, you'd be bored. We had loads of books on board and tapes, but when you get up in the morning and you check your sails, you do your navigation, you check the engine, what have you, and then you have breakfast, and then you do the washing up and clearing. It's nearly lunchtime, and time just goes. It's incredible.
There's always something to be busying yourself with. I suppose again with it being just the two of you as well, it's not like you could either of you could really take a back seat at any moment because there wasn't anyone else to be doing the work. And so
because it was the days, we have to remember, it was the days before GPS or anything like that, and so you have to get used to using a sextant to try and find where you are. But by and large, if you have a cool head, I always kept one clock on Greenwich time and one on local time, you would know the direction you're going. You would know roughly how far you have gone. So if you have, and you can see when the sun is overhead, where you get the shortest shadow where you are, that's midday, then you could calculate roughly within 200 or 300 square miles, which is nothing when you consider how big the ocean is, roughly where you are.
And so you're using techniques, really, which have been used for hundreds of years beforehand.
Exactly.
Like you're mentioning the sextant there as well.
Exactly.
Sort of the techniques that we used in the golden age of discovery.
Well, once again, you're really measuring the distance of the sun, which side it is off the perpendicular where you are, which gives you a very rough idea whether you're north or south of the equator, if you like, even roughly where you are position-wise. So you could even with, as long as you knew what Greenwich time was, and you know where the time where you are, and you can see roughly, you could work it out approximately where you are. At least we have the advantage over Columbus. I used to say to my wife, if anything happens to me, don't worry. Just where the sun goes down, you follow. We know there is land from Canada to Cape Horn, so you're going to hit something. And when you hit it, you say, where am I? They say Brazil. You said, fine, that's where I was aiming for.
But you aimed for and got to the Caribbean. What was that like as an experience? So you've had this, you were talking about the Pacific before, but you'd obviously had this impression of, tropical island paradises, which is very much the case in the Caribbean as well. Did it meet up with your expectations when you got there?
Yes, to a large degree. I mean, okay, that was I knew what I would find. I did actually cross the Pacific. I acted as crew to John Wormold when he was on our tour. They had 28 boats circling the road for 2 years, Gibraltar to Gibraltar in 2 years. And wow. I joined him from the Atlantic side of Panama to Tahiti.
So you got the Pacific experience as well.
Well, yeah, we would have had it, but when those days in the early 1980s, coming up the Caribbean chain, a lot of it was scrubland, poor natives, mediocre food, and few shops. And my wife, she liked arriving. She liked to see the places. She wasn't interested in the sailing side. And when we got to the Virgin Islands, she said she didn't want to go across the Pacific because of not across the Atlantic crossing I said she thoroughly enjoyed. But she said, why come across this with the poor natives, scrubland? Why sail 3,000 miles to the Marquesas? And she had a point, grant that. And so we went up to the Bahamas and then into Florida and eventually up to Annapolis in Virginia. And, I didn't want to... The question was, we could have brought the boat back. In those days, you didn't need a 40-foot boat in the Isle of Man. A 28-footer is quite sufficient for weekend sailing or the odd week around the Scottish Islands. And to take it in the Mediterranean, you could only once again sail in the summertime. And so the summertime is very nice here in the Isle of Man. And so we sold the boat in Annapolis. With hindsight, which is always a good thing.
Of course.
I should have kept it in Florida and then used it. There are 800 islands in the Bahamas. It's 80 miles from Fort Lauderdale, Miami to the Bahamas. No distance at all.
That's on your doorstep, really, isn't it?
And then you could have gone down there in the winter.
Yes.
However, be that as it may, it didn't happen.
It didn't happen. But it's like you say, it's you can still get the nice weather here sometimes, at least. What was the Pacific experience like in sailing with a crew like that?
Well, once again, to me, it wasn't so exciting because when you arrived at a place, the organisers were there to meet you. They showed you where your berth was. You had a list if you want more gas, do this. They had runs to supermarket. The idea of finding your own way is much more, for me at any rate. In earlier life, I had a wonderful experience during my accounting training. I was just after I'd passed the intermediate. I was invited or seconded to a firm of accountants in South Africa, and I spent best part of a year out there. And during that time, the senior partner was doing a survey of a timber concession in the Belgian Congo, and asked whether I'd like to go along as his clerk. And I said, fine. How do we travel? He said, well, we fly up with Belgian Railways. They had a de Havilland Dove, which they'd flew people around, and we come back the same way. So I said, well, would it be possible for me to come back overland? He said, yes, if you want to. And so at 20 years of age, I came down from the centre of the Belgian Congo, as it then was, all the way back to Johannesburg. And that was a fantastic experience. And I think that really gave me the thrill and the enjoyment of travel.
That sense of adventure that it brings.
Exactly.
Because I suppose, were you raised on those stories of colonial, exploration and heroism and that sort of thing?
Well, one gets raised on English history.
Yes, yeah. Which, in that Victorian period, 30 to 50 years before your birth was where it was, so much of it was taking place, wasn't it? So,
exactly.
So what was that like at the time?
Oh, that was fantastic, because you had to take a train from where it was really, if you took the Belgian Congo as a circle, this little town was right in the centre of that circle. And so you had to take a train which stopped every 20 minutes to load with fuel, logs to go. You were going to go to this town. It only ran about once or maybe twice a week, it may get there on Tuesday or could be Wednesday. And then there may be a boat there to take you up the upper Lualaba, which is part of the Congo, upper reaches of the Congo River. That only runs once a fortnight. So, and it was all ifs or buts, but it worked, and the people were wonderful, and everybody was smiling. And if you had £10,000 on you, you'd be quite safe. If you put it down and left it for an hour, I wouldn't guarantee you'd be there when you came back. But providing your own thing, or if you're on the train, you could get up, leave things lying around. There would be nothing to it. And the food on the train and on the boat was excellent. They probably couldn't write properly, so if you wanted fish, they just drew a little fish. If you had soup, they drew a circle. If you wanted meat, they drew like the horns of bull horns. And then at the end, they just see what they'd written on the paper tablecloth, and that is what you paid for. You crossed over then into northern Rhodesia, as it was, and you had the white linen and the cutlery and lousy food.
Because it was still British at the time, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
Of course, northern and southern
Yes,
Rhodesia.
that was before their independence.
Before their independence. So you got to see some of that period, which was, I suppose, coming towards the end at that time. Certainly over the next couple of decades, a lot of that started to come to an end. So, I can understand that. Well, from the conversations that we've had, you do seem to have a real sense of adventure. So you think it was that trip that instilled that in you.
Definitely.
What about some of your other travels? Then where else have you got off?
Well, both my boys married American girls. The elder boy, Colin, went on Camp America. You're nodding your head, so you've obviously heard of Camp America. I have
friends that have done that
sort of thing.
Yeah,
they come across to Europe and take over 17, 18-year-olds to work in the summer holidays. They pay all expenses. You work for 6 weeks. They take you over for 8 weeks. The last 2 weeks you can stay on camp if you want to, or all your expenses paid there. But if you go off camp, it's down to yourself. And he met an American girl, when he went out on that, which clicked, and they've been married now for over 30 years. And they live in a concrete jungle called Dallas. And when his younger brother used to go out, they made up a foursome, and one of the foursomes clicked. And so they're both out there. And as they are, we and they had different confirmations for their children. We were going to hire a motorhome, because I reckon that the time we flew back and flew out again, because if you go to one, you've got to go to the other.
Of course.
The cost would balance itself out. And Cruise America said, knowing the length of time, well, why don't you buy a used one off us? We do a deal. So I said, what's the deal? Well, you buy the one, and after 12 months or 12,000 miles, we'll buy it back off you for 60% of what you paid. So I said, oh, that looks great. So we went for the deal, and we kept it for 20 years. And we travelled through 46 of the lower 48 states. We've travelled across Canada 2 or 3 times, out to Newfoundland, across to Alaska on the other side, down to Mexico 2 or 3 times. And it's once again, it's the people you meet in these places.
Yes. It's what's always astonished me about the United States and Canada is just the sheer scale of everything, the distances that you travel, and the gaps between communities at times, and just how that changes people's perceptions of what a long distance is, of what a long time to travel is, and it completely, compared to somewhere like here, it's just completely on another scale, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I can give you an example of that. When I had the boat in Florida, we used to fly home periodically, of course, here. And one case when I flew back, it was, I can't remember the name of the hurricane that went through Homestead and obliterated Homestead, which is about 20 miles south of Miami. And we were taking a Greyhound bus down to Marathon, where the boat had been docked, one of the islands at the mid of the chain. And sitting next to me, got chatting with, and he was a joiner from Maine, which is one of the northern states, and he was coming down to go to Homestead, having been a hurricane, to get a job. That's over 1,500 miles he was travelling just on the hope that he would get a job as a joiner.
So it wasn't even guaranteed?
No
Wow.
Guaranteed. But Americans are like that. They will go anywhere where there is work.
Yes. The work ethic is...
The work ethic.
is incredible,
yes.
there, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
So it sounds like you really enjoy...
And that is what is really needed today. I find it less and less, the work ethic. People use their plastic card. I mean, I'm old school. If you can't afford it, you don't buy it.
That's
Simple.
the accountant in you speaking as well, isn't it?
I know. It was also, even before plastics,
Sure.
That was how we were brought up. When I started life, if you like, as a small child, I was given threepence, 3 pennies old money. That was my pocket money. Period.
Yes, of course.
There was a much stricter discipline, was much harsher then.
Well, do you ever think back, because at 90 years old, you've lived a long life, and you've lived through a period that has seen such incredible change. I mean, does it feel sometimes like it's been almost like more than one life, or that you're looking back on someone else's, or?
Yes, it obviously has been. I mean, the technology is so advanced. The human brain, I mean, as one says, and it is very true, get a kid of 11 to do your computer for you, because old fuddy-duddies like me can't comprehend it. And years ago, while the Falklands was a strategic island, it was half a stop when the sailing boats came from Australia to refuel and provision or whatever have you before. It took 3 months or something to get from Australia to England for a letter to get back.
Yes.
And then 3 months going back for a reply. Nowadays you get an email, and if you haven't answered it within 3 hours, they say, where are you? Why? 70 years and 10, you're still cold meat. So what's the hurry?
Absolutely.
I mean, I get told off because I very, very seldom carry a mobile phone. They have their uses. But all day you walk down the street, what do you see? People with fingers.
And I suppose if you have spent the vast majority of your life without one and got by perfectly well without one, then you haven't seen the need to to adopt one.
They are useful. I usually take one at night in case there's an emergency. If you're in business, they obviously have their use as well, but they're used far too much. And the information, as it's now transpiring, is not necessarily the truth, which is propagated through mobile phones, internet, and what have you. And I think we're running ahead of ourselves.
Yes, I wonder about that sometimes as well, whether or not we as people and whether or not our brains have actually really caught up with the technology yet. So it's interesting that you feel similar as well in that respect. Yeah. I'm not too sure about it. It's almost as if there is space, the space needs filling. You know, if there is space to talk about something, or if there's space to put news in, then they put news in it, regardless of whether or not it's actually telling you anything new to any great extent. So, like, for example, with 24-hour news coverage, it's like you can't just stop that when you have to keep it rolling, don't you? You have to fill it with something. And it's almost like information overload, I think, for us at times. Exactly. And it was one of the reasons why I wanted to start doing this podcast, was to just sit down and spend more time just talking to people without distraction and without all this other stuff flying around. I think that can feel quite overwhelming at times, can't it?
Yes. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. You were talking about technology, though, but some things you do seem to be more keen on, like when you came up for your interview at Manx Radio a couple of weeks ago. I was very impressed to see you turn up in an electric car, in a BMW electric car, driving that. So there's certain technologies do appeal.
Well, yes, it was interesting because, as I said, going back to my accident on the M1 motorway, and when I recovered and I was going to go long distance sailing, I decided it was necessary to take a navigation course, which I'd never done in my life. I mean, I had a small boat in Ramsey Harbour, and I used to sail to Scotland. Well, I knew if I went due north, when I saw land the other side, I'd turned slightly to my right, I saw the hills. I wanted the second bump would take me to Whitehorn. And when I came back, I used to head for Jerby, because that's centre of the island. So if Manannan's cloak came down, at least I would have a width to the point of air without hit land. Whereas if I was aiming for the point of air and missed it, I would be in Holyhead before I saw land. And and on this course, I got very friendly with a lad or a man who had been in the army, and when he was in the army, at 1776, the bicentenary in America, they put out a blurb that they were putting a sailing craft, anybody wanted to go in. Well, this friend of mine, David, he was in Remy, and he worked on tanks and heavy vehicles in Northern Ireland. And he thought he'd try this, and he put in for the mechanic. And they never had a mechanic in the army before apply. And they thought, well, maybe this sounds good. Of course, everybody wanted to sail, didn't they? And so they took him, and he got hitched on that. And afterwards, he decided to go on a navigation course. And that is where I met him, and we're still friends since then. And when he left the army, went into the motor trade, generally, garage. He became warranty manager at Mercedes, actually, too. And he phoned me up one day, and he said, why don't you change your car, get an electric one? I said, I don't need one. He said, your car's 11 years old. I said, no, it isn't. He said, go and look at your logbook. And it was. And he said, I can get you the new BMW range extender. And I said, what in the hell is that? So he said, well, it runs on batteries, but it also has a petrol backup. It hasn't got an engine, but the petrol that you have 10 litres, feeds the generator, which charges the batteries, which pushes the car. And we went into the logistics of it and the cost of it, and it was no more expensive than the previous BMW I had. And so we changed cars, and it is beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
They're very impressive looking little machines. What's it like to drive? Is it strange?
No,
going from combustion?
It's virtually a one-pedal car, because as you take your foot off the accelerator, it slows down automatically. And if you judge it right, you never need to hardly ever use your brake. And, of course, you save the road tax. I pay £5 a year road tax, which is because of the generator. And I've been all over England with it. The charging stations, they need to update those and many more of them. But with the range extender, it automatically changes to your fuel if your batteries run out. And that will give you another 60 miles of driving. Well, when you've done about 40, you go to the nearest garage and top it up again. In point of fact, in the bonnet, there's a big well of nothing. So I've got an extra 5 litres of fuel in that.
Right.
So it's belt and braces. And I've been all around England 2 or 3 times with it without additional charging. Just when the battery runs out, just go onto fuel.
Is it the future, as far as you're concerned? Is it the future of vehicles
Oh,
going
definitely.
electric?
Oh,
Yeah.
without a doubt. They're comfortable, they're silent, you don't have the fumes or the noise. Yes, and they're cheap to run. And also you get night tariff if you have a home charger. You go on a night, which comes down, I think, from 16p a kilowatt, 16p plus, to 9p plus. But either way, I haven't noticed any real increase in my electricity bill.
Going off at a bit of a tangent here, but it's something that I wanted to speak to you about, was I can't remember why this came up, but you mentioned it in passing when you came up to Manx Radio previously, that this, and it's one of the stories that stuck with me, was that you were at Winston Churchill's funeral. Can you tell us a bit about how that came about and what it was like?
Yes. Well, I worked in London, just a very short distance away from St Paul's Cathedral, and so I became a friend of St Paul's. But I was also a member of the Scriveners Company, the Worshipful Company of Scriveners, one of the city livery companies. And the registrar and receiver of St Paul's was also a fellow scrivener, and we became friendly. And it was through him that on the 30th of January 1965, I was given a ticket to the funeral of Sir Winston Churchill.
At St Paul's, obviously, and an occasion, well, one of the largest and I suppose most solemn occasions in Britain for many, many years, probably certainly since the end of the war, or certainly the death of the King in the 50s, I imagine.
Yep.
And what was it? What was the day like? What was it like to be there?
Oh, you had to. Oh, well, the interesting thing about that, you had to be there 2 hours before. I still do have the booklet of the timings for all parties, the royal party, and it's timed down to the minute when they will leave Buckingham Habit, when they'll arrive here, when they'll do this, and so it all joins the various processions of the Lord Chancellor. But they did have a problem because of the number of people in the cathedral and the number of foreign royalty coming. When they brought the coffin in and put it on the bier, there was difficulty, it was going to be difficulty for the pallbearers to take it back off the bier where they have to turn right the way round with it. There wasn't sufficient space. And the cathedral came up with the brilliant idea of making the bier into a turntable. And whilst the public didn't know, there was a little man sitting under the bier, for his sole job was at the end of the service to turn the little handle which would swing the coffin round in a circle.
Quite an interesting role to have on the day, I imagine.
Yeah.
What about the people that were there? What was it like being amongst the great and the good of society?
Oh, well, I was in the South Transept Gallery, actually overlooking the royal family. And opposite the royal family were the other royals from the various countries as well. And then on the, well, to my left, in the front row was the Prime Minister Harold Wilson with his cabinet. And George Brown, who was then the Foreign Secretary, said he wasn't going to attend the funeral. And on the night before, Harold Wilson said to him, "You will attend the funeral," because they did have the list where the usher had to alter all the seatings because they sit in prodigal. And he put it through gritted teeth.
Why had he not wanted to go?
He was a staunch Republican
okay.
And everything else, and didn't like Churchill or politicians. Not much different from today.
Still squabbling. But the sense of occasion must have been huge.
Oh, it was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, they're the sort of things that one can never forget.
It's living a real significant moment in history, but experiencing it through your own eyes, isn't it? Which must have a...
Well, I am a great traditionalist, and I do believe in that an Englishman's word is his bond. And I have said to more than one person in my life, if your life a person whose word is worthless, so is the person.
Very, very wise words there. Let's look a little bit at your life here and some of the things that you've done here, because something that you mentioned the last time we chatted was about your involvement with sheltered housing. And I understand you built or were involved in building the first sheltered housing complex in the Isle of Man.
Yeah, well, had I had a choice of a youngster, I would have been an architect. To be fair to my old man, he gave me a choice. You'll be a lawyer or an accountant. And I didn't want to be a lawyer.
And there was no arguing in those days, I suppose.
No. Oh, no.
You had that choice of one or the other, but that was it.
That was it.
Yeah,
end of story. And you did as you were told. And in my day, if I didn't, you got a whacking. I mean, today they would call it child abuse, but when you're a child, you accept it when you know no different.
It's a very different time
and
as well.
It is. And I think in some ways we've gone too far the other way today. I mean, with meals, with kids, they now get a menu. What would you like for dinner tonight? You know, we take it or leave it.
Yes, you're given that.
Simple. But
so
coming
the two
down
options,
to that,
yeah.
when I gave up sailing, when I said I didn't give it up, but when we came back and sold the boat in America, I knew I'm not one for playing 5 rounds of golf a week and doing the garden. And I had, being a good socialist, I had a redistribution of weight. And I had to get my trousers let out. And just under the hairpin bend was a Liverpool man who came from Liverpool. He had a tailor shop there, retired, he needed alterations. And it was a few years just after the Savings and Investment Bank went bust. And Barrule Park and all that lot, they'd started building. The builders went bust along with the savings because they had loans from the bank. And I said to him, "What's happening here?" And he said, "I think somebody's sniffing, but there's a field behind that," which was 9 acres of ground, largest plot nearest to the centre of Ramsey, with planning permission for high-density development. And I looked at it, and I made the liquidators an offer, which they accepted. And so I landed with that. And then it was a question what to do. I wasn't interested in building houses per se. I think even today there's very little newness about them. They're nothing more than updated 1930s. You have one master bedroom en suite. Now that's, you're really good there.
Yes.
But the other 3 bedrooms, whatever, one shared bathroom where you all have to go out the corridor or you go away on holiday. You get self-en-suite accommodation. Why don't you have it in your own home? And I looked around and then found that you had well-heeled come-overs, one spouse dies, what happens to the other one? They either had to go into, they would then be beginning to convert the Victorian boarding houses into apartments.
Right.
And they had to go into one of those or government-sponsored places. Well, I think government-sponsored places should be for the indigenous Manx, not for the well-heeled come-overs. So I looked around sheltered housing in the UK. When we went to the States, I looked around their senior citizen housing and decided to build the sheltered housing accommodation. And we were first. Ballaston Gardens was before Saddle Mews.
And providing something, therefore, in the community that you thought was missing.
Yes, definitely. There was places where they could look. Originally, I didn't even have garages there. Because there were loads of parking. What happens if you have a garage? 90%, I guarantee, of people who have garages use it for storage, and the cars remain in the drive or in the road.
Yes.
And I wanted people to look out onto grass and scenery, not onto concrete cars. But then one or two said, "Oh, I always put my car away in the winter," or "I go away on holiday, I like my car." So I applied for 20 garages. We got 20 garages, and they're occupied.
And I think, is it property is something that you've continued to be involved with on and off? I remember relatively recently there was the opening of some new accommodation in Ramsey, which I think you've been involved in.
Well, I still had a little piece of ground abutting Clebain Drive, on which we have now built 3 places completed. And I built the last one just up to damp-proof course, because all the planning permissions, hopefully that it would be of interest to a first-time buyer, because they've got all the plans there.
And again, you think so that's something that's maybe lacking to an extent, is the accommodation, properties for first-time buyers in particular?
Well, they say it's lacking, but they also find that banks aren't necessarily lending the money.
Yes.
Even though they say they should or will to do, when it comes down to it, it doesn't happen.
As you've already alluded to, you're not really a man that can sit still, are you? Like you said, you don't like 5 rounds of golf and pottering in the garden. So you've been involved in other things, such as sailing for the disabled as well, a charity here in the Isle of Man.
Yes.
Which does great work for people with disabilities and it gets them out doing things.
Definitely. Yeah, well, when, once again, I've been there since 1999 and still quite active on the administration side of the charity.
What's it like going out on the boats? What are the journeys like, and how do the people respond to them?
Well, here we're sailing
for the disabled. What do you feel it does for people?
Oh, they're wonderful. It's very good for team building, and the people with disabilities enjoy it. Most of them enjoy it, some of them don't. I mean, I've had instances where you see children which sit rigid all the time, and you think, well, this child won't come back. And then you hear from the parents they thoroughly enjoyed it. When can they go out again? You can never tell. But it's a very good outlet and help to kids or anybody with disabilities. Indeed,
it's for some. Yes, they really find a sense of enjoyment in it, don't they? And it's a very well supported charity. There's the relatively new vessel, the Pride of Man 3, is it now? Yeah. Well, you've taken a little bit of a back seat with the charity these days, have you?
Definitely, yeah. Well, at 90 years of age,
you feel like the time was...
I think the time has come. Well, I gave up actually being skipper when I turned 80, because I voluntarily did that, not for fear of being incompetent, but I can remember what happened to Jimmy Lomas, the architect of Summerland, when the fire happened there. He was in the Mediterranean, and newspapers said architect is cruising in the Mediterranean while 49 people died of fire. I mean, it broke him completely, and it wasn't his fault.
No.
He took all the materials to the fire department or what have you, and they were past what were being used. So, I mean, but there it is. And I thought the same. If an accident had happened with the boat, what is an 80-year-old doing in charge of disabled people?
So even though...
So I'll go as mate, but not as skipper.
Sure, yeah, that's understandable. So As you've got older, then have you found that you've needed to strike that balance between, you obviously still want to be active and do as much as possible, but you come to a realization that there are some things that you can't or should no longer do?
Yes. Yeah, my partner, Marion Bolam, who was the fundraiser for Sailing Disabled and collected the money really for the ongoing boats which they've had, she, I believe, would like me to put my slippers up, watch television all day. But I'm very sorry, I don't do that.
Well, yeah, so you have to strike this balance a little bit more these days, and sometimes
well,
realise
things are slower, understandably. But as long as I'm active, I'll keep going. I'll retire when the good Lord decides to take me.
When you expire.
Exactly.
You will retire when you expire.
Yeah. Good.
Because that was something that struck me when we did our interview. You know, when you said that sort of life is for living and every day is a gift. Is that how you've always felt?
Yeah. Oh, yes. My great uncle founded an old people's home in the, I think, late 1920s, early 1930s, and therefore, from a child, I've always been brought up in that environment, and have always cared. Well, I was on their house and investigation committee in later life on the home, and I've always felt that way. You know, it is good to be alive. It is good to enjoy every day. I say I'm going to live to 125. I hear people say, oh, I've got this ache or that ache, I don't know how much longer I've got. I think it's telling the brain to close down. Every day is an adventure. Every day is a special day.
Well, I think that's an attitude which really, really does help. It's like if you feel young, if you feel good, if you feel fit, as in if you tell yourself these things, you're pointing to your head there, so they're very much that mind over matter.
Exactly.
But to retain that, I think, is something that's impressive, so impressive to your age. I've often wondered about that, whether, you know, how much things are chicken and egg as one ages, and once things start to break down a little bit, if you let that then become a bigger thing, and like you say, tell yourself that you can't do things anymore, or
then you won't do them.
Then you won't do them. So it's about having that opposite mindset as far as you're concerned, is it?
Well, I'll tell you one quick, interesting little story. Years ago, when I was a teenager, coming home late one night, going towards the car, a tramp comes up to me, says, "Give me £1, Governor." I said, "If I give you £1, you'll only drink it." He said, "No, Governor, I don't drink." He said, "Well, you'll only smoke it." He said, "No, Governor, I don't smoke." I said, "Well, you'll find some woman to go with." He said, "No, Governor, I don't." I said, "Well, get in the car. I want to take you home and show my parents what happens to a man who doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, and doesn't go with women."
Now, we've just spoken about this a little bit, Alan, but before we finish the podcast, what I've always asked my guests is what have they learnt during their time on this earth? If there was one piece of advice that you were to give to someone, what would it be? I imagine, would it be along the lines of what you've already said about just living life to the full, and that every day is a gift?
Always remember the saying, "I was walking along the street, for I had no shoes, until I saw a man who had no feet." And if you realise there are always people worse off than you, be thankful for what you have got.
And that's but
today there is too much greed and selfishness around. I must have. Do you really need it? One's needs and one's wants are two completely different things.
Alan Cope, thank you very much for joining us on Time Enough.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.